Hello, and welcome to the check-in for community connection and conversation over the airwaves here on KBIA. We're in the midst of turbulent, even dangerous times. There's no need for us to replay the numbers and the statistics right here, right now. You've heard them before. But we can say that having all of this played and replayed in the media and in real life for us day after day can definitely take a toll, especially for our Black families, students, and kids. How do we talk about the grief and loss that is part of life and takes center stage right now? What can we do for our students and kids who are feeling loss and even trauma from these events in their own lives, as well as having them so prominent in the media? Well, today we have a professional who lives in these conversations all the time to help us with these really difficult questions. Professor Tashelle Bourdier is a specialist in youth development. She researches grief and loss specifically among African American youth in MU's Department of Human Development and Family Sciences. Her published work has focused on bereavement and resiliency within marginalized communities and how those grieving experiences intersect with racial power structures. There's a lot to unpack there. Let me first go ahead and welcome you, Professor Tashelle Bourdier. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
We're so glad you're here. Let me just say to our listeners, you can join this conversation with Professor Bourdier. What conversations are going on in your household? How do you talk about grief, loss, social justice issues with your family, with your kids? If you're a Black parent or a Black student, we'd especially like to hear from you today. And before diving into that conversation, let's just check in really briefly with KBIA reporters Rebecca Smith and Sebastian Martinez Valdivia. They've been covering the protests unfolding here in mid-Missouri. Becky Smith and Sebastian Martinez Valdivia, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us, Janet.
Okay, so Becky, you produced a piece highlighting the voices of protesters and participants in the rallies. Your kind of subtitle on the piece that we have on kbia.org was, "We just want the pursuit of happiness." What's the context behind that quote that you pulled, and what stood out for you from the voices that you gathered?
Of course. So I covered the demonstrations on Monday night here in town, which unfortunately there was some violence towards protesters that evening. We saw 2 protesters actually be struck by vehicles. But other than that, the night was really about people coming together and talking about, kind of like you mentioned, Janet, the shared trauma and grief about what was happening in Black communities. And that quote in particular really stood out to me. I was talking with Robin Wynn. She's a lawyer here in town and works with the NAACP. And she was saying, she just really kept saying, this is about all of us against a racist system, against racists, because we want to be able to have our Black fathers and our Black uncles and our Black, cousins and children to be able to go out onto the street or sell a CD or do all of these sorts of things without having to, have the fear of having their life ended. And so it really was just about trying to share that the desire for these protests, for people gathering to, share this space, to share this grief, was about trying to say, we just want our rights. We just want that pursuit of happiness. We want to be able to do these things safely and know that our family members are going to be safe. And that was really one of the things I heard time and time again from the individuals that I spoke with. The 2 young organizers, one was a Black woman who has several children who are Black, and she said, you don't have to worry about, if I had kids, if they went out of the house, whether or not they're going to kind of come back alive. And she said this is a conversation she has to have with her kids, and I believe she said her oldest child was, maybe young teenager, if not even a little younger. And the other mother, who was one of the organizers, has a Black son who's 7 months old. And she said, I don't know what world my son's going to grow up in, but I want to try and do whatever I can to make sure it's better than what's going on right now. And so family and that fear for family and that love for family really seemed to be what I was hearing from everyone I was speaking with that night. It seemed to be a through line of the Columbia protesters here in town.
All right. Well, you're listening to The Check-In. We're checking in here together on KBIA. We're speaking with KBIA reporters Rebecca Smith and Sebastian Martinez Valdivia about what they're seeing at the protests they're covering here in mid-Missouri. If you've been out and involved participating, you can join us. Let us know what you're seeing, what you're thinking. 573-882-9136. We're also talking today with Dr. Tashel Border about grief and loss and social justice, where all of those intersect and how we talk about these things, how we deal with these things in our communities. And these impact a lot of the students, a lot of the young people that I think are out there at these rallies. Sebastian, you were covering what was going on in Jefferson City. What was it that you saw there? And I, it's occurring to me that these are largely young voices. You two are fairly young reporters, so in some ways you're young voices, kind of telling us what you're seeing. So I appreciate that. But what were you seeing, Sebastian?
Yeah, so there were a group of, I tried to estimate while I was there, but it was definitely upwards of 250 to 300 people gathered on the south lawn of the Capitol building. There was a thin line of National Guardsmen and state troopers, and then on the other side of the big fountain that's there was the main staging ground, essentially. And it worked almost like an open mic sort of situation. So there were one or two people who were basically connecting all of the different speakers and introducing the speakers. And it was kind of one of those situations where anybody who wanted to speak could come up and speak into the megaphone. And so, like Becky said, in Columbia, there were a lot of Black mothers who spoke about the concerns that they have about just letting their kids, go out, and have that fear of, them being policed and then being arrested or killed, as has happened in a number of cases. So there were a lot of really common shared experiences. And one of the things that stood out to me was the emphasis that several of the speakers put to the white attendees, because there were a lot of white attendees, to have conversations with their family members and with their friends, difficult conversations about race, because they said that, too often white people just stand by if somebody in their family says something racist or something, offensive or misinformed, and they avoid the conflict of pointing out that that's racist or that's misinformed. And so that was one of the through lines, was really urging people to be accountable to hold their friends and their family accountable and have those difficult conversations. But after that kind of, it was more or less an hour and a half of those speeches, of people sharing those stories. And then they marched down High Street in Jefferson City, and then they marched over to what used to be kind of the Black Historic District. So like here in Columbia, we had the Sharp End. In Jefferson City, there was the Foot near Lincoln University. It was a historic Black business district that was kind of torn down in the name of urban renewal, and next to Second Christian Church in Jefferson City. And so the crowd marched there. They laid on the ground for close to 9 minutes in honor of George Floyd, and then they marched back to the Capitol. But yeah, it was really interesting to hear how similar so many of these experiences were, and I think that's why you're seeing these protests all across the country, because these are experiences that Black Americans have all the time, and now sharing those and expressing those publicly.
Right. What you say is very true, Sebastian. Thanks for that. Let me just remind people, this is the check-in on KBIA. We're talking with KBIA reporters about what they're seeing out at the protests and rallies going on right now in mid-Missouri. If you're participating, you can join us. And particularly let us know what you're seeing that's difficult and how you deal with that, how you talk about these things with families, kids. Are you a student? Let us know what's on your mind. You can join us also for the conversation we have coming up here with Dr. Tashel Border about loss and social justice and the grief and trauma that we have to deal with our families and how we do that. Sebastian and Becky, let me just hit you with a double question here before we say goodbye, which is just really general. For people who are not participating, what would surprise people about, if anything, about what you're seeing? And also, do you have anything generally to add that I haven't covered here? Becky?
So I think one of the things that people who maybe aren't watching the news as closely, who aren't, as connected to these experiences, should realize is that this is a group of people that is hurting more than anything else. And, they're trying to find ways to come together, to have a community, to share those feelings of fear, of pain, of grief. And that seems to really be the through line, is finding shared support. And I guess the only other thing that I want to make sure to point out is I ran into Mary Ratliff, the president of the NAACP here on Monday night, and she mentioned that one of the things she really hopes is that these younger individuals are get more organized and get more involved in these organizations that have been fighting against this kind of systemic racism for years, like the NAACP, like other groups, just so that they can have, once again, that shared sense of community moving towards, resolution.
All right. Actually, let me go ahead because what you're talking about, Becky, is so much about what Dr. Bourdaire deals with all the time with families and the sense of hurting that you're talking about that you're seeing at these protests. Dr. Bourdaire, can I just welcome you to the check-in and bring you in for a response to that?
Sorry, absolutely. So we are seeing large amounts of grief and bereavement in this through the protests, or I would say it's much more visible through the protests. And sorry, and I can't tell about my volume. In terms of how people are expressing themselves in various ways, I guess I always like to just begin with a basic definition of what grief is and what it looks like. Grief, in general, is a response to any type of loss, a death loss, and then also to even non-death losses that we view as significant. And so what you see when you see the protests, is a manifestation of what people are experiencing every day at home as they navigate their lives, particularly, individuals who are marginalized, be it racial marginalization, gender, and so, or ethnic marginalization, or type of violence that people deal with in different ways in policing and even in their own communities in terms of interpersonal violence. So grief can be expressed in numerous ways beyond tears, right? So I think part of people's reaction or misunderstanding of what's going on is we're seeing actions, and so oftentimes people, we see tears, but we also are actually much more likely to see people, grieve through actual behaviors, whether it's putting in more hours at work or putting in hours, protesting, right? Some people grieve physically. They need to be behaviorally. They need to be out doing something to express their grief, whether it's a silent protest or, and again, I want to be clear, I'm not encouraging any type of, destructive expressions of grief, but I also want to highlight that we see destructive expressions of grief all the time as well. So here we're seeing it visibly on television through these protests, but I want to say it's not completely uncommon to see this and see this on an individual level for people who, do destructive things like buying things they can't afford when they're grieving, or, do other hurtful things like harm another person, or engage in other behavior that is not productive, or safe. So I want to highlight that we're just seeing it on a larger scale. Some people right now, even in your audience, they might be noticing their own grief because we have allies in the community, right? Other people who also believe beyond Black populations and female populations who believe this is problematic, that things need to change, and are also grieving collectively around these losses. And so you all might notice in this audience right now, because I always think these discussions are important, that you might be sleeping more or really struggling to sleep. I know a lot of people are struggling to sleep right now between coronavirus and then these losses that have been highly publicized in the media, among many other losses like this that are happening with police, by law at the hands of law enforcement. So I just wanted to highlight that again. People might express grief through tears. They might express it behaviorally. Some of you may be eating more, eating less, stomach aches, headaches. So grief is expressed in a variety of ways. And I just want to make sure, and they're all okay as long as people aren't getting hurt, right? As long as they're done in, hopefully pro-social ways. But we as a culture tend to judge people's expressions of grief simply because we are only looking for tears, but a lot of different things are manifestations of grief. And I even think this basic audience should be aware of yourselves and how you're feeling right now, and name it as grief, because that's what it is and not something else. I think that's important for everybody's healing and advocacy efforts as we move forward through this really difficult time.
That's great. Dr. Bourdieu, thank you so much for just immediately giving voice to what so many of us are feeling right now. You could not have said it better, and I so appreciate it. Before I've barely even introduced you, when Becky said that what she's seeing is grief on the protest and rallies, I thought we actually have to let you jump in and just give a comment here. So thank you so much for that, and we are going to unpack a lot of what you just said, Dr. Bourdieu, over the next few minutes here that we have on KBIA and the check-in. First of all, we want to get to a caller we've got, but let me just say really quickly, thank you so much, Rebecca Smith and Sebastian Martinez Valdivia, for joining us today. And please be safe and good luck out there.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Sebastian.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Becky. Okay, let's take a caller, Dr. Bourdieu, if you don't mind. We'll go to DW is calling us, I believe, from Kirksville. DW, thanks for calling. Did you have a comment for us?
Yes, I do. Thank you very much for taking my call. I wanted to let you know there was actually a very peaceful protest in Kirksville yesterday. Over 300 people showed up. If you're familiar with Kirksville, it's on Baltimore Street, Business 63, for over a mile. People lined one side of the highway, and the response was actually very positive, very few negative comments, and it was a very successful, peaceful rally. All ages, all groups, everything. So I just want to report that in from Kirksville.
That's wonderful, DW. Thank you for that. And that does seem like a really big number. And in fact, you may or may not know that we I don't know if you're calling from Kirksville, but we are broadcasting Kirksville. So Kirksville listeners out there, thanks for listening, KKTR. And you can also call the same number, 573-882-9136, anytime you want to check in with us. So we hear you, Kirksville. DW, thank you so much. Do you know if there's anything else planned in Kirksville?
Not for sure about that, but if there is, I'll let you guys know.
Okay.
But yes, do listen all the time up in Kirksville. Glad you guys reached that area now.
All right. Thanks for listening and thanks for checking in,
Thank
DW. You. Take care. Okay, Dr. Bourdieu, let's dive back into the conversation that we've kind of already started here. Let me just also ask you, you're in these conversations all the time, unpacking grief, the definitions of grief, the various expressions of grief that you just really kind of unpacked for us a little bit there. Let me just ask, what are you hearing from the families and the people that you work with right now?
What I'm hearing is really, and I'll be honest, similar concerns that I deal with. My specialty area within bereavement is really around stigmatized losses, such as in particular homicide, and all of the different, complication things that further complicate grief for people when a death is specifically when a death is related to violence and homicide, and particularly by an entity, whether it's interpersonally, a person who looks like them, or especially if it's a person who's supposed to be serve as a protective, serve a protective function for them.
Yes.
So what I'm hearing is kind of the similar things that I've been hearing for a while, and that's that, parents have concerns. I see it in my research. I see it in everyday encounters with families and in schools, that families are concerned about their children, about their partners, their, uncles, aunts. I also want to highlight that women are also dying in this process. They are next to die in terms of statistics after Black men. Black women are also dying. So I just want to highlight that. Well,
yes,
we're focused. There's a lot of focus on that in the media. So I guess I also want to say that there's also a population of people who understand that their daughters are also vulnerable, not just very highly across their development to sexual assault, but to police violence, to violence at the hands of law enforcement as well, and death, like we saw with Breonna Taylor. So
yes.
We're seeing, and we're also seeing this from allies. I want to say, I think what's really important this round is that, and I think it's really important is that there are a lot of allies, as DW, and thank you for your comments, DW. If I got that, it is.
Yes.
That we are seeing, and it's hopeful, right? When people are grieving, they need to see examples of hope and ally formation. So a lot of things that I'm hearing from a lot of people who are non-Black, who are wanting to figure out how they might talk to their children about this, who are wanting to figure out how they might support, whether it's, being out there in a protest or making a donation to Black Lives Matter. So there are a lot of, I'm hearing from people who are marginalized racially, but I'm also hearing from populations who are really focused on being allies, increasing their awareness of privilege and how they might use that to be supports for their friends and also for themselves, to educate their children, so that we have a new population of people who are aware of yes. issues of racial and injustice and sexism and all of these other things, so we can all live together in the same space peacefully, right?
Yes, absolutely. And you mentioned Breonna Taylor, who was really tragically killed in Louisville, and 20-something young woman, I think working as a nurse technician. You just really think of the parents and think of the families and in those tragic stories, and there's so much to think about with this. So I'm glad you mentioned Breonna Taylor and women, and Black Lives Matter was begun by women. So that's another angle to this, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, let's unpack a little bit of this, but let me remind people, because we really only have a few more minutes already. You're listening to the check-in. We do have a couple of lines open if you want to check in with us. How are you talking with your kids, your students? Are you a student? How are you dealing with grief, loss, and how the grief and loss intersects with social justice for you? Are you trying to figure out how to be a good ally? Sounds like Dr. Bourdaire is getting a lot of those questions. How are you talking to your family about this? How are you being a good ally, or how are you just getting by? We'd love to hear from Black parents, Black students, and get your perspective on how you're dealing with this right now, particularly. But wherever you're coming from, we've just got a few more minutes, but we can work you into this discussion if you have a comment or if you have a question for Dr. Tashelle Bourdaire. Dr. Bourdaire, there's so much to ask you about, but you talked about the complications and the various forms of grief and the stigmas with violent deaths and the grief following that, but also cumulative loss. I feel like cumulative loss, that phrase was pushed to me from a producer who had spoken with you. And boy, that's what we're seeing right now and dealing with. How does that complicate things, and how do you even begin to address that?
Yes. And again, something that I think many people on this call might be able to relate to is when a loss of any kind, when individuals are dealing with cumulative losses, right? So we just, even with coronavirus, if I might help people be able to just think about this for yourselves, whether you're a part of the Black community, the white community, Native communities, Latino community. When we deal with losses, multiple losses across time, it really compromises our ability. It can compromise our ability to deal with each subsequent loss, particularly when we don't have supports in place, when systems are not in place to provide adequate support to populations who are dealing with these losses across time. So there's not a lot of support. I can tell you that many counselors are not trained in race-based trauma. Many counselors and therapists are actually not trained in loss and bereavement. And there are many who are doing great. So this is just, I'm highlighting this because it just is not really a part of the educational processes. So I think that they're doing their best. I will say that. Communities who are dealing with cumulative losses, so multiple losses across time, your emotional energies, your physical energies. Again, you may have heard at this protest and in the media that people are exhausted. Yes. We're just emotionally exhausted from the notion of having to just repeatedly have these conversations, repeatedly trying to explain privilege and homicide and why it's not okay. People are making, there are videos of people making fun of putting their knees in people's necks, and that's just re-traumatizing for people who are dealing with loss, both Black populations and also for allies. So I guess so across time, cumulative losses can really compromise our ability to cope. And can lead to these other behaviors, right? There a sense of despair can develop when people don't see changes starting to happen. So I want to say things like, and I always want to bring some images of hope too. I do want to commend the officers who are taking the knee with families, because we're here to work together, right? And so that's a form of affirmation of a loss. One thing that tends to happen with violent losses in particular that make this really challenging for people to grieve, especially the families, but also people who are observing, is that they deal with stigma around, where the victim is blamed for their own death, right? They must have done X, Y, or Z. You know,
Yes.
what did they do before this thing that prompted this officer to press his neck, put his knee in this guy's neck for 9 minutes or however long it was, instead of also just focusing on so anyway, without getting into legal aspects of this, the point is that there was a lot of criminalization of this guy who died, death that we witnessed, right? And so the person who dies is criminalized. That's hard for families. You know, when a person dies by a natural death, you go to the funeral, and grief is a lifelong journey, by the way. We never get over it, and we never just move forward. For people who are bereaved on this call, you understand that. But in our society, we want to rush people past their grief and say, just get back to life. Well, the truth is, in a homicide death, there's a trial, right? You end up seeing the perpetrator on trial. So there's the difficulties of grief. The most difficult parts of grief are just prolonged. Also, deaths by homicide are publicized in the media, right? And so families are, and as well as the rest of the population with collective trauma, are watching these repeated images of this guy's death just play over and over and over. I encourage people, by the way, not to put this on your Facebook page. It's traumatizing. If you want to be helpful, if you want to be an ally, please don't put this on your Facebook page or show it any more than it already is. It's traumatizing for your viewers. Believe it or not, it's traumatizing for you. And it's traumatizing for children to see this repeatedly. So keep that in mind. I also want to highlight something that is unique for Black populations is Black bodies are far more likely to be played. There is little privacy in general for people with homicide loss, right? It gets on the news. Your loved one's name is on there compared to natural deaths by like cancer. And again, cancer is all deaths are important. I also want to say that I'm only highlighting that these are specific things that add unique complications to death by homicide. Yes. All deaths are hard. So in any case, I just want to say that just being careful of those kinds of things,
right?
And doing what we can to visibly demonstrate change. Like we need to see visible changes to offset, you know, these constant representations of Black bodies being deceased. It's reminiscent of historical times when people were lynched and it was like publicized and put in photographs and sent out to people. So there's a lot of historical trauma associated with this for underrepresented populations, Black populations. So understanding that this has a whole nother level of trauma and grief for people. And one final thing I want to say is that when we decide to punish people, a concept that I developed is suffocated grief, and that's the idea that grief is further heightened and complicated when people are punished and penalized for their normal grief reaction. So when we see protesters out there who are quietly, and actually even the ones who are making noise, I mean, who are protesting, who are expressing their grief, get penalized and criticized and sprayed with hoses and things like that. Well, not hoses, whatever, tear gas when they're simply walking down the street quietly, then they're being penalized. Their grief is being suffocated. Okay. In these cases. So we don't want to penalize people for normal grief reactions. And again, that's a concept that I developed, but I want people to name their grief experiences when they see them and to know that that's what that's causing, is suffocated grief. And those are my comments.
Well, sure. Those are great comments. So necessary for us to hear. Dr. Bourdaire, thank you so much for being with us. We so appreciate you joining us today, and we would love to keep the conversation going right now. But thank you for joining us, and please take care.
Yes, thank you to the allies out there, and I'm thinking of you all. Take care.
Thanks, Dr. Bourdaire. Thank you. I apologize to the callers. Thank you for calling in. Please call us again. We will keep these conversations going all this week, including tomorrow. We'll have Professor Mike Middleton with us tomorrow talking about the context historically for civil rights and protests. We'll also talk with Tracy Wilson-Kleekamp about our systems and how we can change them here locally. Thanks again for joining us on The Check-In. I'm Janet Saidi. Stay well and stay in touch.